Tystnad. Hej och varmt välkomna till Folk och Försvar och detta seminarium som heter Europe as a Security Provider. Today's seminar will be held in English. My name is Pasi Ukri and I'm the Program Manager for Security Policy at Folk och Försvar. A warm welcome to all of you who have joined us here at the venue and for those of you following us online on YouTube. With us today we have an eminent cast to discuss this subject. We will start this seminar by listening to the French ambassador to Sweden, who will give his reflections on European security and sovereignty. After Ambassador Gonville, we will listen to Jens Nyqvist, who is currently serving as the Deputy Chief of the Defence Staff and formerly as the Swedish military representative to the EU and NATO. Nyqvist will talk about the current state and future relationship between the EU and NATO and how they interact. We will finish the seminar by looking towards the future with the distinguished Göran von Sydow and Alina Engström from SIEPS and from FOI. After they have spoken, the audience will have a chance to ask some questions. We have, since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, seen a huge shift in European security policy and identity. The discussion now is if Europe is on the path to becoming or already has placed itself as a geopolitical actor. Europe is now experiencing shifts that were impossible or improbable just a few years ago. Two examples to illustrate these shifts are Germany and France. Germany has gone from repeatedly missing the 2% target on defense spending and having a dependency on Russian energy to a completely different reality. Energy import has shifted away from Russia. Zeitenwende has included 100 billion euros for the Bundeswehr. It has meant becoming Ukraine's largest military supplier after the United States. France has also made a shift after full-scale invasion. From vetoing Albanian and Macedonian membership to the EU to stand today as the strongest proponent for European enlargement. France has also been more open to Ukrainian membership in NATO in the future than other allies. And President Macron has gone from saying that Russia must not be humiliated to Ukraine must win, a clearer message than a lot of the other European allies. Europe is stepping forward in the realm of geopolitics and as a provider of security. This seminar aims to discuss these areas and continue the important discussion about the future of Europe. We are honored to have the Ambassador of France to Sweden as our first speaker. The relationship between Sweden and France was highlighted during the state visit by President Macron to Sweden earlier this year, and I'm glad that we can continue some of those discussions that were touched upon then here today. I welcome Ambassador Etienne de Gonville to start the seminar. Welcome, Ambassador.
Tack så mycket. Thank you very much. God morgon allihopa. You can hear me well? Yes. So thank you very much for inviting me. And since this seminar is about Europe as a security provider, I will focus on where we are in the European project on defense, the European Defense Project, and what it brings to our own security and sovereignty. I will not start with concepts, but with a few hard questions. So the European Union has been developing over the past 25 years a common European security and defense policy. Over these 25 years, would we say that this common security and defense policy is the thing that has made us safer? Honestly, no. Thanks to this common security and defense policy, have we inspired respect, some fear in other actors? Have we deterred other actors? The answer is not really. Have we sometimes been paralyzed by fear? When it came to Russia, quite certainly. So this is where we were in European defense after 25 years of trying to build something together and be respected as a geopolitical actor on the international scene. But all that is changing, as was said in the introduction. It is changing, but it is good to come back to the model that we had 25 years ago and that never materialized, and that is still the reference we were supposed to work on. Our model at the end of the 90s, based on our experience from the Balkan wars, was a model that was focusing on conflict prevention and crisis management, not collective defense. Collective defense was the thing of NATO, and what the EU was doing was something completely separate. We had very high ambitions for this European model of crisis management. And if you go back to the Helsinki European Council in December 1999, it gave us some headline goal for what we should do in defense. And it is always useful to remember what that headline goal was. Member states must be able by 2003 to deploy within 60 days and sustain for at least 1 year military forces of up to 60,000 persons. So back in 1999, we, the European Union, had the ambition of being able to deploy for 1 year 60,000 people on an external military operation. That, of course, never materialized, and this may be the reason why this European defense policy never really made us safer or was never really respected by our partners around the globe. As we said, all that is changing, and there is currently a revolution in European security affairs or in European military affairs. It started to be fair even before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It started with initiatives by the European Commission to support the defense industry in Europe. It started with ad hoc formats like the European Intervention Initiative that was proposed by France in 2017, and that aimed at strengthening a common strategic culture between the main committed actors on the European continent. It started with a shift in our defense expenditure, triggered by the Russian annexation of Crimea. France had started to raise its defense budget back in 2017. Sweden had made the same choices as well, had started to reinforce its conscription, to remilitarize Scotland, and so on. So there were already signs that we were going to do things. But the formidable acceleration came, of course, with the start of the invasion, and also our doubts about the future of US politics. A key moment in that change, and a key reference for what we are doing today, is, of course, the Versailles Summit in March 2022 of European leaders, and the Versailles Declaration that gave us a clear roadmap. That declaration says that Russia's war of aggression constitutes a tectonic shift in European history. And we, the heads of states and government of the European Union, decided to take more responsibility for our security and take further decisive steps towards building our European sovereignty. If you remember, there were 3 key dimensions in Versailles: bolstering our defense capabilities, reducing our energy dependencies, and building a more robust economic base. And this is still what we are doing. This is still what the European Council that is meeting today is doing. The results can be seen already. The European Union has now taken a much wider view of defense and security matters. It includes resilience. It includes the strength of our societies, its resistance to hybrid warfare. We never speak about collective defense in Europe. This is still the business of NATO. We do not also use the phrasing common defense. That's a long-term perspective in our European treaties. But what we're doing is actually contributing to collective defense and to a sort of common defense. The European Union today has become the main actor of totalförsvar on the continent. And this Swedish concept is what I think defines in the most proper way what we are doing now in Europe. We are building total defense. We are building totalförsvar, thanks to the action of the European Union that is strengthening NATO. The other thing that can be seen on the ground is that our talk is actually matched by our walk. We are increasing our defense budgets. We are strengthening our armed forces. They are becoming more robust. They are also becoming combat tested for some of them in operations. When we had this Helsinki headline goal in 1999, it was very ambitious, but at the same time, our budgets were shrinking. So, of course, it could never materialize. The context is now clearly different. We are also more agile. We do not rest only on tools that will be manufactured by European institutions or European frameworks. We use the European tools, but at the same time, we use ad hoc initiatives. We are able to be imaginative. When it comes to supporting Ukraine with ammunition, we have what we do nationally, we have the European initiatives, and we have ad hoc initiatives. We have the Czech Republic and the Baltic states coming with new ideas and new sources of procurement. And we are using the full range of instruments that we have at our disposal. And what is remarkable is that the traditional instruments of crisis management that we had developed over those 25 years are still there, and we're still using them on top of the rest. We have a mission now to train the Ukrainian military, Ukraine, and we deploy ships in the Red Sea to protect international trade, ships that are actually using their weapons to destroy aerial targets, and that are learning from those engagements. So where do we go from there? Honestly, and we all know that, there is still a very long way to go before we are able to, as the Versailles Declaration said, take more responsibility for our security and build our European sovereignty. There is remarkably no longer a debate on whether it is the EU or NATO, the EU versus NATO. When I started working on those issues of European defense 10, 12 years ago, that debate was still present in France. It is not the case anymore. It is now the EU and NATO. The European defense project is definitely strengthening NATO, and both organizations are working in sync for our collective defense. What we need to do as a priority now is to strengthen the credibility of the Europeans within NATO. Implement the burden sharing that the US has encouraged us to do, mainly through increased defense spending, but also through an operational culture that is credible. We should do that as a priority, and at the same time, we should prepare for the worst, because of all of the uncertainties we have when it comes to US politics. We should not be the victims of a strategic surprise when it comes to our security. And that strategic surprise will not even be a surprise if it materializes one day, because it's been announced for years and years that at some point maybe we will not always be supported by our US ally. Our whole reflection on European defense was also grounded in this possibility that sometimes the US will not be with us. We have hard questions now. What if we had to deal with Russia alone? But before we ask this question, we had other warnings. What if we had to deal with Daesh alone, for instance? What if we had to deal again with Daesh in the Levant alone in the future? Are we ready for that? Do we have the tools for that? Do we have the determination for that? All those questions are still on the table, and they are the very questions that we need to answer when discussing European strategic autonomy, European sovereignty. These concepts are just the answer to these very hard questions that we need to ask ourselves. Defense readiness, when it comes to the tools, the actual tools, we're not there yet either. The instruments we have at our disposal for the moment are only a fraction of what needs to be done. There is an ongoing discussion on whether it's the member states or the institutions that are most well placed to build European defense in the future, to support the European defense industry. The European Commission has put on the table a European defense industrial strategy backed by a European defense industry program of 1.5 billion euros over 25-27. There's an ongoing debate inside the European Union on who is the best actor. What does this amount represent? Is it too much or is it too little? That healthy discussion is going on and will also be part of our discussion for the European elections. European operations, they still need to be more robust. Our capabilities, as I mentioned, are being combat tested right now in the Red Sea. We're learning a lot from that. Outside of European operations, these capabilities are also tested in other theaters of engagement, and some European countries have contributed to the defense of Israel in these last days. And we are also learning from that and becoming more robust and more credible, but we need to work on it. The European strategic messaging, which is an essential element of the respect that we should inspire, the deterrence that we should also project outside our borders, still need to be refined and harmonized. It is clear, it is still hesitant. You just have to see the debate that rise after the declarations of President Macron on February 26, after the dinner in Paris on the support to Ukraine. There is a willingness from some European actors to recreate strategic ambiguity when it comes to the dialogue with Russia. Obviously, that aspect is not always completely well understood, and the type of strength we should project not completely grasped by everybody in the European debate. So we also need to work on that. What changes, again, is that there is now a consensus that these different aspects are the priority, that the European Union has today the means of being respected, of being a much more credible geopolitical actor. And we will exploit all of those dimensions for the future and for the future of the European Union. So as a conclusion, in 2024, when we look at the European Union's defense policy, is it making us safer? Well, if you include all the potential of the member states plus the EU tools, the answer is definitely yes. The EU is more and more perceived as a security insurance by its member states and by countries that want to become members of the European Union. Even Denmark changed its position on European defense and renounced its opt-out on those matters. Do we inspire respect? If you take our global reaction since 2022, everything from the military tools to the sanctions, I would say definitely we do inspire respect. Are we paralyzed by fear? Well, we've shown with COVID, with the energy crisis and so on, with the euro crisis back in the time, that the EU doesn't really fear crisis. But something was lacking. And the Ukrainians have told us now not to fear Russia. And that hopefully will last. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. You were talking about this shift happened well before the full-scale invasion. You mentioned the EII. If we look at a different shift in the United States, we'll see if the House of Representatives will send a Ukraine bill or vote on a Ukraine bill, but it's been stuck for months in Congress. Is there something more the EU can do to support when the US is not getting that aid to Ukraine, have we reached our end? This is where we're at, talking about ammunition that takes months or years, not days to do.
So a few things. Hopefully the US situation will be resolved in the coming days. There are now optimistic vibes coming from Washington. But it's a clear warning to us. We should and can definitely do more. And we will do more. We should not forget that we have started a number of initiatives that have not yet materialized. We have started a number of investment in our defense industry that have not yet given results because it takes time. But all of this will slowly come online. We're building an industry assembly line in a way. So it takes time to build the assembly line, but then it will start to deliver. President Macron was in Bergerac last week to inaugurate a new line of production of powder at Urenco, a French company that builds powder for ammunition and that is present both in Sweden and in France. That company, Urenco, is increasing its capacity. We are producing more Caesar cannons right now in France. MBDA is producing more missiles. It takes time to assemble the components to build the stocks, but it will deliver. The ammunition initiative taken by the European Union is also going to deliver more ammunition to Ukraine. The Czech initiative is coming online, slowly but surely. So all that will happen. The F-16, all that will materialize at some point. Now, is that enough? It is not enough, and we know it's not enough. It's not enough for our militaries because we will need to reconstitute stocks. We will need to be stronger in the future. It is certainly not enough if the war in Ukraine needs to be sustained for a number of months. And there we reach hard questions about our public finances, for instance. It costs money. Do we need to borrow money at the European level? That question was raised during COVID. It's coming up at us. It's coming back at us. Should we leave it all to market forces, or should we have more intervention of the state into the defense industry? This is what happened in wars, and we're talking nowadays about a war economy that needs to step up. Do we want to go that far? I don't know, but these are the hard questions that we will need to discuss for the future.
Another hard question we saw when Iran attacked Israel on April 13th. American, British, French, and Jordanian air forces and navies shot down Iranian drones. Did French participation in that action move France or other nations closer to doing the same over Ukraine?
So, well, I think President Zelensky and the whole Ukrainian people are asking this very question, and we owe them an answer. The first answer we have to give them is to procure them with more ammunition for their air defense system and more systems. Now we have to be clear that the contexts are different. When it comes to France, we are present with an air base in Jordan. So we participated in the defeat of the Iranian aggression by mobilizing our air forces in Jordan to defend Israel, the Israeli people, but also the Israeli people and all the populations that live in and around Israel, but also our allies in the region and Jordan in particular. So there is this configuration that is very different, of course, of the context in Ukraine. But the question that is raised again is how do we ensure that the air defense of Ukraine is tight enough so that similar attacks on Ukraine that are happening every week are being defeated.
Thank you so much for your reflections, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you.
We will now move on and look a bit closer on how the relationship between the EU and NATO looks like. And I welcome the current Deputy Chief of the Defense Staff and former military representative to the EU and NATO, Admiral Nyquist, to take the stage. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Does it work? Yep, that's good. Perfect. Thank you. First of all, of course, ladies and gentlemen, and to Folk and Försvar, thank you for the opportunity to have me here today to provide you with some answers to the questions that I have been given. I will try to give you a picture of the structures of the EU and NATO, how they cooperate and enhance each other in the European security environment. This is central to understanding the relationship between the organizations and how European security can be strengthened. And if I start with the first question, how does the European Union and NATO cooperate? Well, 2024 is a year of anniversaries. The North Atlantic Treaty turning 75 years and the EU Common Security and Defence Policy, the CSDP, celebrating 25 years. The establishment of EU Common Security and Defence Policy in 1999 was the starting point for this EU and NATO relation. The relation is still stable and a healthy one, although very much characteristic by the well-known political constraints setting the framework for what actually can be done. The EU and NATO cooperate through various formal settings. The joint meetings between the North Atlantic Council, the NAC, and the EU Political and Security Committee, the PSC, is a political format where the national ambassadors meet each year. At the military level, the national MILREPs, my former position, gather in the regular meetings between the respective military committees in the EU and NATO. So there are several meetings ongoing between EU and NATO. These meetings are somewhat easier to organize since the most of the MILREPs, they are double-hatted. I would say all my colleagues are double-hatted, working both in the EU and NATO, which is making things easier, I would say, between the MILREPs and easy discussions. representing their countries in both formats. I had the pleasure of sitting in those both committees for, in the EU then for 3 years, and in the NATO since 5th of July 2022 on the NATO side, when we become invitees to NATO. In parallel with the official meetings, there are frequent staff-to-staff contacts between the EU and NATO. The informal relations is as important as the formal one, or even more important with informal ones. Furthermore, NATO has a liaison team at the EU military staff, and reciprocally, the EU has a small staff cell at the NATO headquarters in Mons in Belgium at SHAPE. Information exchange is vital to avoid unnecessary duplication and to facilitate utilization of the respective comparative strength of the EU and NATO. I would say the best recent example is regarding military mobility, a topic that has received a lot of attention when troops from various allies were to be deployed to the Baltic countries and Poland within the framework of NATO forward land forces. Moving armed forces across Europe in peacetime involve bureaucratic procedures for border crossing, which have to be simplified. Furthermore, it has become obvious that some infrastructure, roads, railways, bridges, etc., is not really fit for purpose for this amount of troops moving. These are primarily, I would say, NATO problems, but you will find the solutions within the EU in terms of decision-making, legislative capacity, and the financial resources that will be the solution. If I move on to the second question, does the security architecture takes its lead from the EU or NATO? I would say EU and NATO are both security providers, and they complement each other. NATO is the main provider of deterrence and collective defense of allies. EU focuses on crisis and conflict management outside the EU borders. I would say that's one part, that the EU operations can only happen outside the EU borders for that. Regarding collective defense, one could argue that the wording in Article 42.7 of the EU Treaty is more or less the same as in Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. However, there is no consensus in the EU that Article 42.7 should include military means for collective defense. For some EU member states, collective defense is politically unthinkable, and for some, an unacceptable duplication of NATO. The division of labor is without any doubt completely clear. EU and NATO don't have any forces of their own, to remember. All military forces they might need are to be contributed by the nations in the respective organizations. Each nation has a single set of forces which can be put under a NATO or an EU flag. Most national forces can be declared as available to both EU and NATO in parallel as well. EU has over the last years launched a number of defense initiatives to stimulate collaborative capability development. The Permanent Structure Cooperation, the PESCO, and the European Defence Fund, the EDF, are useful cooperation tools and financial instruments for the EU member states getting together in developing military capabilities. PESCO and the EDF represent tools that are available in the NATO framework as well. The EU tools are also important for Sweden as an ally in our efforts to implement our national capability targets set from NATO. Number 3, what strength do both organizations bring to the table, and how does the military structure align with the EU? Security and defense are the core business of NATO, and the alliance has a permanent command structure manned by the allies. Any ambition to duplicate this structure in the EU side would be undesirable and unrealistic. The only permanent EU military structure comprises the EU military staff, the EUMS, and the military planning and conduct capability, the MPCC. An operational headquarters able to lead smaller operations, including the new EU rapid deployment capacity. the RDC. The EU institutions in Brussels employ roughly, I would say, 40,000 people. If we look into the military side, approximately 400 of those 40,000 are military position or dedicated for defense issues. This, I believe, is a clear indicator that defense is not always on the top of the EU agenda. This has partly changed, of course, over the last couple of years, and the current efforts to support Ukraine is an example in this regard. Fourth, how will they cooperate in the future, the EU and NATO? What will a future military structure in Europe look like? From my perspective, I don't think we can expect any dramatic changes in the near future. At the military level, the cooperation is as trustful and transparent as it can be. You are aware of the political issues on both sides that set the framework for information exchange and common efforts. At the end of the day, these political constraints have to be accepted or they need to be solved. A pragmatic and ambitious approach is needed. This is to make the most of what we actually can do. I believe we can and should cooperate more, especially in development of military capabilities. This is not only my personal view. My country supports an even closer relation between the EU and NATO. Political speculations are, of course, outside my scope, so I will refrain from any attempt to predict the future. But I would say it's obvious that any change from the United States regarding its commitment to NATO will also affect the EU-NATO relationship. Last one. Is there a risk that we could see tensions between the EU and NATO increase? And with that, I would like to rephrase the question and delete increase from it. Since I don't see any real tension between the EU and NATO. 23 countries are both allies and EU member states, which ensures a stable and fruitful relationship between countries and entities. I was double-hatted when I served in Brussels, and so were 21 of my MilRep colleagues. I met more or less the same people on both sides, and this fostered mutual understanding and trustful relationships. Finally, EU and NATO are not competing, they are complementary. The application is not an issue. Both EU and NATO are providing strength in making Europe safe and secure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Admiral. If we look at since the full-scale invasion, of course, Swedish focus has been NATO, 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 when looking at the media and discussions. But if you look at the European defense cooperation from the full-scale invasion to today, are there any major changes that have happened that we have missed or that has not gotten the attention they should have?
I think, of course, it might be natural now when just becoming an ally to NATO that there is a big focus and a media focus towards NATO. But it's very important to remember that all the efforts that are being done, I would say, within the EU, not at least regarding training of Ukrainian soldiers, etc., for that, and all the parts that we come together and in the procurement efforts, trying to build more ammunitions, etc. It's very central.
And if we look at 2024, 20 out of the 23 EU members, who also NATO members, will reach 2% of GDP on defense spending before the end of 2024. That, of course, creates strong national capabilities. During your years, did you see any of that sipping through to the EU? You're talking about 40,000 personnel, 400 military. Looking at other projects, you mentioned PESCO. Do you see the same increase in funding, in interest in those projects as we do looking at Sweden going almost 100% in 2024, if you look at 2020 on the defense budget?
I would say that there is definitely an increased focus of increasing budgets in general. Well, EU is strong monetarily. Well, it has a lot of money to be used, and I think that is one of the most important tools for the EU. Military, and they are the ones that really, EU are the ones that really can put efforts on building these capabilities that are needed, maybe in the NATO context, if there is a need for the defense for it. So that's the complementarity, I would say.
You mentioned also what happens in the US, of course, affects NATO and the EU. Do you see the closer EU-NATO cooperation since the full-scale invasion? Is the US reacting towards that? Is it something they're wishing for or being more hesitant? We're looking at defense industry, we're seeing perhaps state investments and such.
To my understanding, I would say the US are positive of the EU-NATO cooperation for it. But then, of course, you will hear that they think that the EU should step up, or the EU nations within NATO should step up in funding.
Thank you so much, Admiral.
Thank you very much.
And we'll move on. And we'll move on to our last segment and a panel. And I invite Göran von Sydow, the director at the Swedish Institute for European Policy, and Alina Engström, who's a researcher at the Swedish Research Defense Agency's Department for Security Policy and Strategic Studies. That's a lot. And I invite perhaps Göran to start for his time, and then Alina right after Göran, and then we'll have some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the kind invitation, and thanks to the previous speakers for making our task a little bit easier, I would say, as they've already mapped out quite a few of the big issues. I will use a few minutes to dwell a little bit on three interrelated questions: where we are, how we got here, and perhaps where a little bit we're heading. And I'm particularly focusing on the EU, or the European side, in this context. And where we are is just a reminder to start with, of course, that we have a big war going on in the European continent. So the whole question of the European security order, of course, is a really central and key one, and that needs to be addressed in one way or the other. That sort of situation also increases the expectations of what Europe can do as a whole, and also the European Union and its actions. And if we're looking at it since the beginning of the full-scale, since the start of the full-scale war going on and the Russian aggression, I would say that European action has been characterized by swiftness in decision-making, by unity, finding unity, although increasingly difficult over time, also by some innovation, that is taking steps that were previously not perceived as possible for political reasons, trying new ways of doing things, using tools that were available but maybe for different purposes. And I'm thinking here, for instance, of the peace facility and other tools that were accessible but now reused in a fashion. But perhaps in the longer run for the European Union and for Europe, there is also the potential of a transformation as a consequence of the situation we find ourselves. And that has, of course, to do with the few days after the Russian invasion, full-scale invasion, Ukraine filed its membership application to the European Union, and this is a fast-moving process as well, and I will get back to towards the end what that may potentially mean for the European security and Europe as a security provider. The second element of where we are is, of course, that geopolitics is very much back. But geopolitics is back in a slightly different way than perhaps previously perceived, touching upon areas that in the domains of the economy and the domains of technology, and also creating interlinkages between various policy fields in ways that are perhaps somewhat new. That autocratic regimes in particular using those tools to exert political influence. And that will now lead me to a little bit how we got here and why Europe is then, or European Union is now doing more. And that's the first element, that when issues are interlinked or when global competition moves in directions in which the European Union has a clearer role, then of course it's quite natural that the European Union also becomes more involved in issues relating to security or geopolitics. That also is the background to which Ursula von der Leyen, upon taking office now nearly 5 years ago, declared that she wanted to lead a geopolitical commission, which to some raised a few question marks. But I think time has proven that this was an attempt and also has been materialized to quite some extent. Has to do with this interlinkages, moving geopolitics into domains in which the European Commission and the European Union has a stronger role, and finding ways of dealing with that. But of course, there's also several other reasons to why we see this development. The most obvious is, of course, the ongoing war and the different crises that we have witnessed, in which there is a call and need for action, coordinated action and unity. That places the European Union in a role and a situation in which it actually can provide that. And within the European Union, the Commission is the initiator that has to take the initiatives for decisions. Therefore, it is also a potentially powerful or more powerful role. There has also been a clear attempts of increasing the leadership capacity, and particularly from the Commission President, and we see the increasing centralization of political resources around the Commission President, in particular when it comes to external affairs. That also leads to an increased role for the EU in the wider scheme. There has been also a number of organizational shifts. For instance, the EXCO, the coordination, attempts of coordinating better the external affairs from the side of the European Commission, but also the creation of a defense and space Director General. So for us studying European Union, we would normally look at those things and we would say, here we can expect some movements going on. And I think we witnessed that. Of course, there's also been a number of other issues, and the ambassador raised them. For instance, the strategic compass and decisions that provide the roadmap moving forward. And I think also the wider frame of strategic autonomy or understanding how Europe can orient itself has also meant something in this extent, to this extent. Now, where to now? I will try to find a few questions to address towards the future. Now, of course, Ukraine is still the number one sort of issue. There are a few uncertainties moving ahead about the unity and actions that are available for the European Union and its allies in relation. And of course, we have now only 6 weeks to the European Parliament elections. They will perhaps primarily not be the center of power relating to how future policies will be directed in this field, but nonetheless, it may also send a political signal that can be interpreted. We see that public support for the currently pursued policies vis-à-vis Russia and Ukraine is high around the continent, but still elections can challenge that consensus, and that will of course also has an impact. And then moving further ahead, which has also been mentioned, there is the upcoming American elections that will also have a very profound, important role for first, the policy towards Ukraine, the capacity to maintain the unity within the EU, but of course the overall and longer-term strategic issues relating to security. And on that note, so I was mentioning that Ukraine is now on its path to becoming EU member. And it was mentioned by Jens Nyquist that there is Article 42.7 in the EU treaties, which in its wording has very strong similarities with Article 5 in the North Atlantic Treaty, although backed by completely different organizations with different purposes, as has been clearly spelled out by the previous speakers. But still, if we consider the potential, and here it's been framed very much the enlargement towards Ukraine as a geopolitical enlargement and of something that in which the European Union can provide security guarantees to Ukraine. So a Ukrainian EU membership or rapprochement, going closer to that, without NATO membership is different from the last enlargement rounds, where NATO membership preceded EU membership. My point is that here maybe there is a question for the future to think about within the European Union. What do we really mean with Article 42.7? Is there really something to back the notion of a solidarity in terms of that Article 42.7 without the NATO framework? Now, finally, just on the EU's toolbox, and it's been mentioned by the ambassador, I share this view that the EU has a wider and broader repertoire. So it deals with different security issues than NATO, and this is the field where we can expect more things to happen in the future. So cyber issues or infrastructure or defense industry and all of those fields, I think. And EU also has the potential, at least, of our financial resources, mentioned by Jens Nyquist. But there is also a question for the next mandate. How can all of these demands, questions be addressed within the EU framework? Because it's not only defense and security where there's need for spending. Final remark, this geopolitical shift, maybe it says something also about the very notion of what Europe wants to be in a world, whether it's more accepting a Hobbesian world or whether it still would like to play the more Kantian role. Thank you so much.
Can you hear me? Yes, I think so. Thank you, Göran. I will speak a little bit more about where we're heading. So that's a perfect starting point then for me, I suppose. So there is indeed a vision from the side of the European Commission and the European institutions, as well as among European states, key large member states of the EU and NATO, that Europe needs to strengthen European defense. But for these visions and efforts and realizations to be fulfilled, however, it will be vital, if not essential, to keep in mind that cooperation and cohesion will be important. And this is valid for both within the EU and within NATO. And there are several multifaceted driving forces that will likely impact the prospects of security and defense collaboration within Europe. There are both external drivers related to geopolitics, as Göran mentioned, and the trajectories and developments in these, as well as internal factors within Europe that may either advance or hamper defense cooperation efforts going forward from within. So the key external drivers, I'd say, are, of course, the threat posed by Russia. Regardless of the outcome of the war in Ukraine, Russia is preparing for a long-term confrontation with the West. This means that Russia will continue to remain a main threat to Europe in its eastern neighborhood in the foreseeable future. The view of Russia as a threat to European security has indeed been solidified in Europe among a majority of member states of both institutions. In a longer-term perspective, however, traditional dividing lines between member states may well re-emerge. Other threats have not disappeared and may intensify. The other important external factor that we have heard about today already is US leadership and engagement in Europe. Europe's dependence on American security guarantees will likely continue to shape how European states' responses to initiatives aimed at strengthening European defense. Several states in Europe, some more than others, are particularly observant on the signaling from the US. They are also adapting in different ways to a trend of the US rebalancing to Asia. And there is a risk of decreasing US engagement within NATO, and countries are not adapting to this situation in the same ways. The third external driver or factor is the growing competition between the US and China. European states will need to navigate its position amidst the growing rivalry between the two countries. European states will need to balance their own security needs with potential shifts in American priorities affecting Europe. China's actions is, of course, also a driver that may influence the trajectory of European states, their priorities and strategies in the coming years. And then lastly, I think it's important to mention and note that developments elsewhere in the world, particularly in Europe's southern neighborhood, has not disappeared. The multidimensional threats emanating from the south may well intensify, and this may affect member states, European member states in particular, threat perceptions, priorities, and strategies going forward, or in a longer-term perspective. And then there are also, of course, internal factors within Europe that are likely to be significant in shaping the prospects for a stronger European defense and more European defense cooperation. These are several of them, but I will mention 4 here, since we have limited time. And it is, of course, that member states or European states have different national and economic interests, and these may diverge or clash in worst case. We also have the internal power dynamics and relationships between European countries. Notably, the French-German collaboration is essential, but also the relationship with Poland, and at large, the relationship between Europe's south, north, east, and west. Also important to mention, and Göran mentioned it already, is a trend of rising populism within Europe. It's occurring within member states, and this holds the potential to intensify these divisions and hamper the ability for defense cooperation going forward. They may also try to redefine the answers to fundamental security issues. And then, of course, also one important internal factor going forward is EU enlargement, as Göran also mentioned, which will, of course, influence several other internal factors, not least the internal power dynamics within Europe, but also the threat perceptions within the European Council, to mention one factor. So to conclude, I want to underscore that it is the interplay between external developments and internal factors in Europe that will likely shape the trajectory of security and defense cooperation within Europe broadly going forward, and for the European Union to cooperate on security and defense issues. The development in the world more broadly, particularly development of these external drivers that I've mentioned here, may well advance or hamper the pace and scope of integration efforts within Europe, depending on cooperation on cohesion. Likewise, internal drivers influence Europe's ability to adapt to these external developments. So hence, to understand the trajectory of European security in the future, it is important to study and discuss these external and internal developments closely and how European states adapt to them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you. If we start in Asia, we see now the European Union has perhaps for the first time really used its economic power in its foreign policy with the sanctions against Russia. Looking towards China, of course, the European Union is a big market. Do you think that, let's say it's now a geopolitical commission using economic power to produce foreign policy, is China looking at that? Are they hesitant about Taiwan? Is that something that perhaps this geopolitical commission is affecting in Asia? If we're looking at external actors.
I can't answer about what China is thinking, but I would say that within Europe there is not one single perception on or view on how to perceive China. I mean, we have the China as a rival partner or competitor, and countries are somewhere either in the scope of one or the other. And this has also led to countries obviously not knowing how to adapt to a situation, an economical situation. Look at Germany, for instance, not knowing what to do with its dependency on China. Of course, thinking about what happened after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine with the Russian gas and energy, weaponization of energy, but not knowing how to navigate. So I think this is an issue where large states such as Germany, but we also have other states such as Hungary, where actually Chinese investments have increased massively, that will have these Überlegungen. These they will have to think about whether what to do with their dependencies in order for them to propose such instruments on EU level, I think.
You have both talked about enlargement of the European Union, and both the ambassador and Göran touched upon tools. Is the enlargement of the European Union, can that be seen as a tool, as a geopolitical tool against Russia? That when you invade a country, well, we might take that country into our union of democracies. We might take Moldova into it, Georgia into it, looking at the Balkans. Can we see enlargement as a tool?
I think enlargement has always been geopolitical. There's always been an element, but this time it's much more. So last time the Big Bang was more transformational, because it was a different context, understood as all of these countries searching to belonging in the European and adapting, attaching themselves to a model in their transformation from dictatorship into what the modern states they are now. Now, of course, you could see this dynamics in the enlargement process had not happened had it not been the full-scale invasion. So in that context, it's a response and it's a signal that the EU can do this, can send this signal to Ukraine, that perhaps NATO is not capable or willing to send. Because also EU membership is, of course, more encompassing. It's a bigger repertoire again to become a member of the EU. NATO has a more narrow mandate. But that means also that there is a road towards membership in the way in which this will take a long time, right? So, but there's, you can keep that road and then provide this kind of security signal effect. But there are, of course, those who are a bit worried that what you do is rather than to export stability through enlargement, you import instability or fragility in our systems. Because any enlargement will also change for the current membership the meaning and the logic of what this club actually entails. And a potential enlargement to Ukraine, it would certainly do that, because it increases the border, and it's also a border which is now very torn. So that's why I'm saying this has the potential also to transform the EU and what it means and what it does, and what's the main purpose of this organization, not to mention all of the other dimensions that would come with it, the financial resources needed to take on member states, new member states, and also the big demands for spending on various other issues. So, yes, I think this is a very geopolitical, and it has to be thought through well, and that's why it's connected to the debate about how to organize the European Union at the same time. And I think that's very important, because after all, so there is a potential, because there are lots of vetoes involved in all this process, national vetoes. And of course there is always a potential, Sweden's road to NATO shows, that there can be bumps in the road somewhere for political, for domestic politics reasons in various of the current member states. And that's something that would be very difficult to deal with.
Might even be the same countries.
It could be some I mean, you can already see now that you see differences. You have countries that are strongly supportive of Ukraine politically and in the ongoing war, but still nonetheless the same countries that have an issue with the the access to the internal market, particularly on agricultural goods, which is, you can just, that's as an example of how sensitive this issue will be in the long run.
We're thinking about, if we look at Russia, some people have mentioned today ambiguity, and some say that perhaps the EU and NATO showed some ambiguity against Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, and back in 2008, Putin saw this as a gap. I can do something that will make that impossible. Is that ambiguity gone when we look at the future of the security order in Europe? Are we speaking with a clearer voice, or is there still ambiguity when Russia looks at us?
I think I'm not going to go into how precisely Russia perceives this, but just one example, and it was mentioned by the ambassador, the Versailles Declaration and the process that led up to what this is, the concept called strategic compass, right? Which is, one can always think, what's the value of those long-term strategies? But as this happened at the very same period as the full-scale invasion took place, my reading of the process was that this actually changed the nuances, but also the content and the balance of thinking within the European Union in a relatively short time, grasping sort of these new realities. And it made it easier to some extent to agree within all the member states. And it made also some voices within the European, I mean, Alina spoke a lot about the different ideas here. I think it actually helped to give voice to those member states, particularly perhaps in the Baltic region or in the Eastern European region, that had already signaled to others some concerns. Those concerns were then met by understanding, for instance, from the French president, who has been one of the key drivers in this process. So I think, I'm not sure if it's a good answer to your question, but as it is now, at least it's been easier to foster this kind of consensus within the Union. Then the key question, of course, will it maintain that way?
Before we open up questions to the audience, last question to you, Alina. You were talking about internal factors, depending on where Europe is heading, different interests, economical, political, different relationships, German, France, South, North, East, West, the rise of populism and enlargement. If you could specify or talk a bit about one of these that you see as the main factor.
Of course. I mean, if we speak about the internal power dynamics, for instance, I mean, German-French collaboration has been essential for several of the efforts that the colleagues have mentioned here today, such as PESCO, EDF, since Brexit particularly. But there is also currently, or at least as the full-scale invasion occurred, the countries of Eastern Europe have been, particularly with regards to Germany, very not pleased with the situation concerning energy, for instance. So I think there is, going forward, a lot of trust to be rebuilt between particularly Western European countries and Eastern European countries, and France has made a clear pivot to the east. Macron has apologized to Eastern Europe for not having listening to them, and I think Germany is also grappling with this process of trying to find a relationship with, for instance, Poland again. And here the Weimar Triangle format is a clear focus of Germany to kind of, because you need to have an anchor in the East and the West, I think, that going forward.
Then we'll open up for some questions. I will start right next to you while we change these.
Thank you. Carlos Neretnieks. One question that hasn't been raised at all, nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons being the ultimate argument when it comes to deterrence. And if we want to see Europe as a security provider, that is a, let's call it, crucial asset that Europe has to have at its disposal. Do you have any ideas, thoughts about that? And perhaps Ambassador Gonville, being the only one in the room who has nuclear weapons, could you please also comment on that?
So we'll start. Do we have any other questions? We'll gather some. We'll start with nuclear weapons then.
Well, I think actually the question is better perhaps answered by Ambassador de Gonville. So, if you don't mind.
Well, thank you very much. It's interesting to see how much we're talking about nuclear deterrence these days, including in countries where nuclear deterrence was not a politically correct topic a few months, years from now. The answer is strategic ambiguity. So the UK and France have nuclear forces that contribute to the overall deterrence of the NATO alliance. That's in the official NATO documents. You have a number of French political statements from French presidents that say that when a French president analyzes a threat to the vital interests of France, that could trigger the use of nuclear weapons, and that is at the basis of the deterrence we want to project, the president would take into account the European dimension of our vital interests. And we don't say more than that, and there's no need to say more than that. That's the ambiguity we want to create in the mind of a potential aggressor. And so it is essential not to say more than that. What we can do, however, is have a strategic dialogue on nuclear deterrence with our closest partners, have exchanges on how it works, not the vital interests and the deterrence effect, but how our forces work, how we are credible in the eyes of a potential aggressor. And these dialogue have been open to our allies, with President Macron in particular has offered a strategic dialogue in his speech on defense and deterrence back in February 2020, which is still a good reference for what we do in this field. And I would say that nowadays there are more and more of our European partners that are interested in having a strategic dialogue with us on this. So this is what we're doing. Strategic ambiguity, creating complications in the strategic thinking of our potential adversaries, and discussing with our closest partners what it's all about.
If I just can add one element, going back to, again, insisting on the importance of the US elections this autumn, which I think will need some rethinking both in terms of the EU, but of course also the NATO European, let's say, pillar. But here also there is the question, as France and the UK are the only nuclear powers, and I think here is also one key element that needs to be further elaborated. As you may recall, throughout Brexit, the UK, they didn't want to have any collaboration on the foreign security policy. But perhaps in such a context, this will also be different after the American elections, and perhaps there is also a more constructive engagement between the UK and Europe, and that would probably be good, I would say.
So we have a question on the third row there.
Hi, Linda Nagar from Concealer International, Geopolitical Advisory Bureau. Thank you all very much for a highly interesting discussion. So I also have a question for Monsieur l'Ambassadeur de Gonville about the European industrial aspect. So how important do you see European industrial cooperation to be as an aspect in this concept of Europe being a security provider? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. I would refer to the CEO of Saab, who now says publicly that we need to shift from a model where we purchase 70% of our defense equipment from the US to a model where we buy 70% of our defense equipment from the European industrial base, because it's essential to everything we've discussed today. If we want an actual burden sharing, if we want to be credible, if we want to project strength, if we want to be able to support Ukraine in the long run, we need a defense industry. And we need a defense industry that masters what it produces, that is not just assembly lines, but that also has a strong research and development and design bureaus, and who masters the highest innovations possible in this new world. So everything we're trying to do at the moment is to make sure that this defense industry is competitive, can survive, has enough orders, and we're learning from what has happened over the past 30 years. We have dismantled a lot of our assembly lines, a lot of our production capacities, and now we're confronting with an emergency. We need to support Ukraine. We need to support Ukraine at a moment when the US is, for internal political reasons, is not able to do so. So hopefully it will solve itself on Saturday, but we never know in the future what may happen. So then, as I said in my presentation, there are hard questions ahead of us. What kind of public intervention do we want in this sector? What has to be left to market forces only? What kind of money do we want to spend on that in the long run? All of these have to be discussed. But everything we're doing at the moment, everything the European Commission is doing at the moment, everything we're doing in our national policies is aiming at strengthening this base. From the procurement side, it has, of course, a consequence in terms of the choices we make. We also need, our governments need to buy European.
Yes. I think we can take a last question. May I ask, is it to the ambassador or the panel?
I think
I
the
would-
ambassador. Or the panel.
The panel that will take them. We'll take the last question to the panel.
Okay, we're talking about Europe as a security provider here today, and my question is, considering the war in Ukraine, the US has put some constraints on what Ukraine can do against Russia, not to, for example, attack refineries in Russia proper because the oil prices goes up. So does Europe have a unified view about what they think Ukraine might be allowed to do against Russia to actually win the war, not just not to lose? Thank you.
Like that. That's a difficult question. Thank you. I normally look a lot at Germany. That's my main focus area of analysis, and I think it's that may be a good starting point. Speaking of the unity, the debate concerning Leopards and concerning Taurus cruise missile at the moment. Germany has been very wary of escalation risks, and that has, slowed down the process of what kind of support to give to Ukraine. And I think that is something that we might see in the future going forward as well, slowing down how the support is being given, so to say. But that obviously, your question, I think, ties into the question about how European states considered escalation risks, I think. That would be my answer.
That would have to be the last comment of this seminar. Thank you so much to the panel, Ambassador, Admiral, for coming, and for all of you showing up at the venue, and those following us online. You can find this seminar and our other seminars on our website. Thank you so much.